Fallout features 122 vaults built by Vault-Tec. Of the 122 vaults, only 17 were designed to function as advertised. The horrifying to the downright bizarre. There was Vault 69, which had 999 women and 1 man. Was this heaven or hell for this man? It's hard to say. Other vaults, however, were not up for debate. They were locations of unfathomable cruelty, harboring horrifying tests committed against the unknowing occupants of the vaults. These are the vaults we'll talk about today, the 10 most insane vaults known to exist in the Fallout universe so far. Oftentimes leaving us with just one question: why? Why would Vault-Tec create a vault like this? Vault 87. Vault-Tec wanted to create a better version of humans, an evolved version of humans. Therefore, this vault was built to study the effects of FEV on humans. FEV is short for Forced Evolutionary Virus. Horrifying tests would be conducted on the vault dwellers. This testing would fail, but in doing so, it would turn humans into grotesque mutants. Grotesque as they might be, some of them were also incredibly strong. As a result, the mutants would eventually take over the vault, killing its non-mutant inhabitants who were conducting these tests on them. Time would pass, and eventually the vault would take a direct hit by a nuke, setting the mutants free to roam the wasteland above. There was one problem. The mutants were rendered unable to reproduce by the experiments they had undergone. Their reproductive organs quite literally disappeared during their transformation. How would they resupply their ranks? That's when they decided to go out to the wasteland and find humans to bring back to their vault and infect with the FEV to create more super mutants, thereby engaging in their very own special form of reproduction. Interestingly, when we visit the vault, we find one intelligent super mutant locked inside. We find Mutant Fox trapped inside of a holding cell with access to one lone terminal. And so he read through it and read over and over for years until we found him. Somehow, this self-conditioning made him intelligent, empathetic, and grateful for us showing up to free him. He helps us retrieve a Gek, but he refuses our offer to have him become one of our companions. He fears being by our side would just get us killed, as we will be visiting a lot of places that don't take kindly to super mutants. The poor original families of this vault had no idea they would be subjected to FEV and turned into grotesque monsters or worse. Many didn't survive the experiments to begin with, and those that did were left disfigured, disgusting, and unrecognizable. This is one of the vaults where we actually know what Vault-Tec was trying to accomplish, but that doesn't make it any less horrifying. Vault 11, one of the most terrifying vaults of all. But first, now let's talk about something that keeps everyone up at night. The question that Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein spent their entire lives searching for the answer to. What would life be like as an adorable, walking, talking mushroom? I know you've been dying to know the answer, and luckily we have the technology to find out. In Isekai, you'll be turned into a mushroom and go on all sorts of adventures, where you encounter a variety of young ladies, both beautiful and bizarre. Naturally, your mushroom's adventures begin by managing and developing a small town. This is what mushrooms do when you're not looking after all. So open a restaurant, a farm, a school, a hot spring, you name it. Enjoy the slow and relaxing life of a mushroom while you discover the unknown lands and meet your new companions. You can experience this one-of-a-kind adventure right now for free using my link in the description or my QR code on screen to download Isekai Slow Life. And be sure to use gift code MUSHROOM to get 10 free wishes. One thing is for sure, you've never played anything like this, so try it right now. And be sure to use my link or my QR code to support my channel. Shout out to Isekai for sponsoring this segment, and thank you for listening. Now, let's get back to the video. Vault 11, one of the most terrifying vaults of all. As soon as the vault doors closed, the residents were notified that they would be forced to sacrifice one person in the vault every single year. Failing to do so would result in the deaths of everybody inside of the vault. Furious with the overseer for not telling them before they entered, they decided that it would be him who was the first person to be sacrificed to appease the computer. The following year, it would not be so easy to decide who would be sacrificed, and so began the tradition of sacrificing whoever was elected to become the overseer of the vault. Voting factions would form like political parties, but instead of trying to win the election, they were making sure they would lose it. Until one year, a woman named Kate was told that her husband would be voted the next overseer unless she performed sexual favors on the men controlling the voting bloc. In a bid to save her husband's life, she agreed. In spite of this, they voted for her husband anyway, and so, furious, Kate went on a rampage, killing many of the men responsible. Afraid of what Kate might do next, the remaining residents voted her to be the next overseer. But Kate was one step ahead. Her first act as overseer was to remove the power from the voting blocks by telling the computer that it would now be responsible for choosing who the next sacrifice was. No longer immune to the hellish game that this vault played with their lives, the voting blocks revolted against each other in a war that didn't end until only 5 dwellers remained. Mentally and physically exhausted, the survivors couldn't bear the thought of sacrificing another person, instead choosing to say this to the computer.
All right, I know you can hear me, so listen up. There's 5 of us left. 5 out of I don't know how many. So, it's over. We've talked and it's over. We're not gonna send anybody to die anymore. So shut off our water, our gases, or do whatever it is you're programmed to do. But we're done listening to you.
To their horror, the computer responded.
Congratulations, citizens of Vault 11. You have made the decision not to sacrifice one of your own. You can walk with your head held high, knowing that your commitment to human life is a shining example to us all. And to make that feeling of pride even sweeter, I have some exciting news. Despite what you were led to believe, the population of Vault 11 is not going to be exterminated for its disobedience. Instead, the mechanism to open the main vault door has now been enabled, and you can come and go at your leisure. But not so fast. Be sure to check with your overseer to find out if it's safe to leave. Here at Vault-Tec, your safety is our #1 priority.
However, the burden of knowing that they had been sacrificing someone every year for no reason at all was too much for all of them to bear. This would lead to 4 out of the 5 survivors deciding to end their lives. So out of the hundreds of people and families that entered Vault 11, only 1 would leave. After years of sacrificing 1 person every year out of fear that the vault would kill everyone if they didn't, the few that made it to the end were perhaps the most unlucky of them all. Vault 12, initially designed to provide shelter for 1,000 people, making this quite a large vault compared to most of them. This vault was designed with an intentional flaw. The vault door would not seal properly when the bombs were dropped, so that everyone would be exposed to radiation, allowing Vault-Tec to study the side effects of radiation on the occupants. This would result in many of those who were exposed to the radiation turning into ghouls. If you've watched the Fallout TV show, you're already very familiar with ghouls, as one of the main characters had turned into one. Eventually, the survivors of Vault 12 and nearby Bakersfield, California, would found the town of Necropolis in the summer of 2083. Necropolis was formed out of necessity because the vault wasn't big enough to hold them all. At first, ghouls are basically immortal but decaying humans, with their skin dripping off of their flesh. Initially, they can speak, they have possessions, and they have a sense of home. They are intelligent and, if anything, a little bit difficult to kill. Unfortunately, eventually their sanity will wane, and they'll become mindless, bloodthirsty monsters. But this is a transformation that can take hundreds of years. As seen in the Fallout TV show, ghouls can consume chems to preserve their sanity for longer, potentially even indefinitely. But for the rest, their fate is inevitable. It's just a matter of time before their mind turns to mush and they're little more than a zombie walking around looking to kill things. You can imagine the terror of the families in the vault when the bombs dropped and the door to the vault refused to close. Those lucky enough to survive would be transformed into disfigured ghouls with flesh falling off of their bodies while they watched their loved ones die. All of this so Vault-Tec could study the effects of radiation on human beings. Next up, we have Vault 19. This vault was set up to test the effects of induced paranoia on its occupants. How far could they be pushed, and what would the consequences be? And most important of all, what could they do to induce the paranoia without using chemicals or violence on their subjects? This vault was split into 2 parts, the red half and the blue half. The red half had its own overseer, while the blue half had its own overseer. Only one of the overseers was aware of the test, however, while the other one was not. The blue inhabitants would begin to distrust the red inhabitants. They would blame them for malfunctioning equipment like water filters. Vault dwellers also sensed Morse code and blinking lights and blamed the other tribe. Children said they could hear voices in the humming of the computers. Were the inhabitants losing their minds? No, not at all. These things were all actually happening. The lights did blink in Morse Morse code, the humming computer was whispering subliminal messages to the children. The infrastructure was being sabotaged. But none of this was caused by the opposing tribe. All of it was the work of the overseer who watched over their vault. Fake medical records were placed around so that the dwellers would find them and think they were losing their minds. The records would show that they had done or seen things that they didn't remember doing or seeing. This sowed even more distrust into the dwellers as they thought they were being drugged to forget everything. But as we know, they were not being drugged. This was one of the prerequisites of this vault. No drugs or violence were allowed to be used to induce the paranoia. Oddly, little is known of what happened to the residents of this vault other than that they began to go mad. We eventually find the vault abandoned and occupied by a wasteland gang. None of the vault's inhabitants were found inside of the vault. Did their paranoia cause them to simply open the door and leave out of their own free will? Is this how the gang that resides there now moved in? For now, all we can do is speculate as to what their fate actually was. Vault 51. This is perhaps the most sinister of all of the vaults. This vault was being run by supercomputer Zax. The computer was first tasked with choosing a leader to oversee the vault. Eventually, supercomputer Zax decided to hold an election as it surmised this was the best way to choose a vault leader. To the computer's surprise, everyone just voted for themselves. The computer was ready to give up on letting the humans choose their own leader, until it was convinced that a true leader would reveal themselves in times of crisis. So, supercomputer Zax decided to create said crisis. It would inflict unimaginable horrors on the population of this vault, with one such horror being the replacing of coffee with decaf. And as horrifying as that is, it wouldn't stop there. It would also convince spouses to cheat on each other, and worse. This included Ruben, who was messaging back and forth with Helen. But what Ruben didn't know is that Zax, the supercomputer, was changing Helen's messages before Ruben received them in order to manipulate him into killing other members of the vault. This chaos and manipulation would eventually lead everyone to being murdered except for one man, Ruben, whose only companion would be the vault computer. He would live this way for years. The vault computer's personality would morph into something akin to Hal from 2001: Space Odyssey, tormenting Ruben and demanding that he perform his overseer duties, even when there was no one left to oversee. Ruben pleaded with the supercomputer and told him that there was no point, there was nobody left. Ruben began to try to break into the mainframe, so Zax stripped him of his overseer title, claiming that he wasn't doing his job anyway and he didn't deserve to have it or the security access that it granted him. Eventually, Ruben finally escaped the vault, only to die above ground in the harsh wasteland. However, this may have all just been part of Zax's plan, because before Ruben died, he would leave a trail back to Vault 51, and Zax would conveniently leave the vault door open, hoping to seduce future wasteland wanderers into continuing the process of fighting for the position of overseer of Vault 51. Vault 75. Everyone that entered this vault were separated into two groups. On day 1, everyone 16 and under was sent to one side, while everyone 17 and older was sent to the other side and promptly executed. From this point, they would use this first group of children to find and create super warriors. The children's lives would be entirely comprised of intense training and chemical treatments until they turned 18. Throughout their training, the children were put through tests that had only two possible outcomes: cardiac arrest or passing out from exhaustion. The children were told that those who made it to 18 would be expelled from the vaults to go out and establish a new civilization. However, in Vault-Tec fashion, this is unfortunately nowhere near the truth of what was actually happening to the children who made it to 18 years old. In reality, when they hit 18, they would be separated into groups yet again. The top physical performers would be ground up into genetic pulp to be reused in the creation of the next wave of hopefully even stronger children. The rest would be incinerated and their ashes disposed of. No one was being set free. No one was leaving the vaults. Everyone that made it to 18 was simply murdered. When an exceptionally intelligent student graduated, they would separate them from everyone else for 15 years to brainwash them into being the next overseer to keep the experiment going for future generations. They would continue to use the successful students' DNA to create stronger and stronger students while executing any of the students that failed to perform for years and years and years. Eventually, one of the students became aware of the reality of the vault, and fortunately for the students, they were now breeding students that were so powerful that they were able to overthrow the scientists in charge, kill them, and set everyone else free, putting an end to the horrifying cycle of murder. Vault 92. The initial guise of Vault 92 was that it would be used to preserve the culture of the time, specifically the music. This sounds harmless enough, right? In reality, Within Vault 92, Vault-Tec ran tests where they would subject their residents to white noise. The purpose? To find out how powerful subliminal messages and white noise could be. Initially, this white noise was used to put the people into a trance and manipulate them into doing simple things like constantly fixing their hair or scratching their ear. Of course, this wasn't enough for the ever-curious scientists running this vault. The scientists' goal was to create subjects that would do what they were told no matter what. Scientist logs are found of them saying, "Imagine a subject that would continue doing what we told them to do, even with 20 bullets in them." Eventually, one of the most susceptible subjects to this type of manipulation became violent and murdered someone.
I can't believe what I've discovered. Just before he died, one of the security team members told me everything. The Overseer has been implanting these murderous intentions in the entire Vault population without my knowledge. Using the loudspeakers in the dorms instead of just the studios, he subjected everyone to the white noise as they slept. He then implanted combat suggestions he claims came from Vault-Tec itself. He must be completely insane. No observation, no controls. I'm going to have to confront him now and make him pay for what he's done. Half the Vault is dead. The other half, fighting for its life. Good luck to all of us. And may God have mercy on our souls.
The scientists, realizing they weren't fully in control of their subjects anymore, decided to program the phrase "sanity is not statistical" into all of the subjects via white noise. The idea being that all the scientists would have to do is say the phrase and the Vault Dweller would stop in their tracks. This phrase is a nod to the George Orwell novel 1984 and is a reference to the fact that just because everyone is doing one thing, it doesn't make the thing they are doing sane, nor does it make the one person not doing that thing insane. In other words, sanity is not defined by statistics. Unfortunately for the scientists, this programming of their test subjects proves to be unreliable. The scientists continue subjecting them to this type of testing until some of the residents start going crazy and begin violently ripping each other apart, limb from limb. It's a horrible way to die, and it's a grim fate for all of the families who are unfortunate enough to be sent to Vault 92. Vault 96. This vault was on the verge of being something great, but instead decided to take a horrifying turn towards evil.
All right, calm down. Calm down. We won't...
Calm down? Eric, what kind of scam is this?
Look, I know this isn't what you expected. I'm still trying to process it all too.
Bullshit. You worked for Vault-Tec. You had to know.
Jeanette, I already told you.
So, the door has sealed. There is no way for us to reopen it.
Apparently not.
And it's just the 5 of us in here?
That's right.
That's crazy. You could fit an entire town in here.
I want to know about the experiments. Are there really 10,000 creatures in cryo here? And instead of preserving them, you want us to experiment on them, induce mutations, optimize for lethality.
Those are our orders. You will all have weekly research quotas to meet.
And if we refuse? Or fall short?
Anyone failing to meet their quota, or otherwise trying to rebel, will be eliminated.
You can't be serious.
Sir?
I'm afraid so.
Initially, this vault was to be a sort of ark. They began by cryogenically freezing every species that they could get their hands on and preserving them in the vault, with the idea being that when they were able to leave the vault, they could use these to repopulate the Earth. However, rather than unfreeze them and use them to repopulate the world, these scientists would be told they would have to conduct experiments on the wildlife in the apparent attempts to create weapons out of them. The scientists were given strict quotas for the number of experiments they would have to complete every single week. However, the problem for these scientists is that they were also told that their failure to keep up with their quota would result in them being executed. After all, nothing motivates you to get your work done like the fear of being murdered. Because the scientists' lives were on the line, even when they were caught up with this week's quotas, they would begin work on prepping experiments for next week's quotas. There was no rest. After all, their lives were permanently on the line. The one upside, all they had to do was survive 250 weeks of quotas, and the Vault computer would set them free. There was a catch though, because of course, this wasn't evil enough. The quotas would keep getting bigger and bigger, week after week. if this week's quota required 30 experiments, next week's quota would require 40, and the week after, 50. The logs showed that week 146 required 524 credits. Week 149 would require 591. It became apparent that failure wasn't just inevitable, it was by design. It was at week 142 when the crushing reality hit them. The scientists realized they would not be able to meet their quota. It was finally going to be impossible. Realizing this, the Vault Overseer went to work on a new plan. He was going to create a computer virus to corrupt the Vault computer so that they could all escape. And to his credit, he deployed the virus and the system shut down, and the scientists were almost able to make it outside. But then the computer enacted the Omega Protocol and promptly executed all of them. The mutated experiments that they created were able to escape out into the wasteland, and the computer sent a help signal out for any unfortunate enough to hear it. What hell it would have been to live every waking moment in fear of execution, knowing that the decks were stacked against you, that the weight you were asked to carry was going to get heavier every single week, and that at some point your failure and therefore your death would become inevitable. Which begs the question, why did Vault-Tec do this? What did they gain by killing their scientists rather than letting them continue to do their research? Or perhaps the real experiment was how the scientists would perform under the pressure all along. Next up, Vault 106. One of the fastest built vault sites built in just 5 years. This vault was designed so that 10 days after the doors closed, it would begin pumping psychoactive drugs into the vault's air filtration system. This vault had 107 occupants, 95 of whom were the test subjects. The plan was to introduce these psychoactive drugs into the air in small, controlled dosages, but something went wrong. The drugs poured into the air continuously. The families inside of the vault had no idea what was going on, but it wouldn't be long before the drugs would have horrible effects on them. At first, some were simply relaxed by the drugs, but soon others would be sent into a craze and become violent and aggressive. Regardless of the outcome, there was one thing all of the drugged up dwellers had in common. Something within them compelled them to stay within the vault. It convinced them that this was the only place to be, preventing any who breathed in the drugs from escaping. Eventually, there were too many aggressive test subjects for security to oversee. The crazed families within the vault went on a murderous rampage, ultimately resulting in the deaths of everyone unfortunate enough to be trapped inside. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. With the vault dwellers dead, the vault continued to relentlessly pump these psychoactive chemicals into the air, and any wasteland wanderers who had the misfortune of entering the vault would subsequently go mad with hallucinations and feel compelled to stay there until their final days. The silent and invisible killer waits in the vault, even now, trapping and eventually killing anyone unfortunate enough to enter. Vault 108. This vault's goal was to study conflict, or so it seems. For this vault, Vault-Tec would intentionally pick an overseer that would die of cancer shortly after the doors closed. They also failed to assign people to a number of critical roles within the vault. This meant that almost instantly there would be infighting as the 475 occupants of Vault 108 had to choose who had to fill all of these important roles. Of course, this wouldn't have nearly been enough mayhem for Vault-Tec, so they also made sure that after just 20 years, the vault's power supply would fail, causing yet more conflicts. And what's conflict without weapons? So the vault was supplied with 3 times the number of weapons of a standard vault. And to add more fuel to the ready-made fire, they chose not to place any of the normal entertainment items in this vault. The families inside were meant to live generations without TV, books, or any form of entertainment. So this was a vault with 475 people, 3 times the normal stockpile of weapons, and baked-in conflicts combined with nothing to distract them from their problems or each other. There was another problem still: cloning. This vault had the rare ability to clone people, and chose to clone a man named Gary. Each time they cloned Gary, he became less able to communicate and also became more aggressive. Eventually, he'd only be able to say one thing: Gary! The scientists cloned him over and over, noting the changes. It turned out that Gary clones were aggressive to all non-Gary clones, but were friendly towards each other. Eventually, one of the clones attacked the scientists in charge, and so he called it quits. It was time to exterminate some of the Garys. They simply had no room for all of them, and they weren't useful anyhow. We don't know exactly what order everything went down in, but somehow the violent Garys escaped their cells and gained access to the incredibly large stockpile of weapons. Everyone that wasn't a Gary clone was murdered. Some of the Gary clones eventually wandered out of the vault and into the wasteland, but many stayed inside, continuing to clone Gary after Gary. The door to the vault sits open today, inviting unfortunate souls to enter. The last thing they'll hear before they leave this mortal realm is the crazy ramblings of dwellers who only know how to say one thing: Gary. Vault 112. All of the residents here would be hooked up to a VR system and get to live in a dream world until it was safe to leave the vaults. Sounds perfect, or does it? As soon as the residents entered the pods, they would be subjected to the whims of Dr. Braun and his games. Ultimately, Dr. Braun would subject these people to a life of being murdered over and over again, endlessly, on loop. Sometimes killing them with scurvy, sometimes having them being eaten alive by a shark. Braun would then wipe their memories to prevent them from figuring out what was going on while he tortured them over and over. Interestingly, the second these pods are opened, the people inside turn to dust. So it's hard to say what the plan or the purpose was for this vault. The pods keep them alive indefinitely, but only so long as they are trapped inside of this virtual reality. Would that version of immortality be worth it, even if it wasn't being overseen by a deranged psychopath? The wanderer who stumbles into this vault is left with the option to free all of these vault dwellers by killing them, or to leave them there to be tortured forever. Killing them is not a perfect solution, but perhaps it's better than leaving them to be tortured for all of eternity. After all, that's basically the definition of hell, isn't it? Which vault would you say was the worst vault to be trapped in, and why? Let me know down in the comments below. Fallout has some fascinating and sometimes horrifying lore. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If so, consider liking and subbing for more content. Shout out to my channel subscribers for supporting the channel in the big way that you do. Hit the join button below the video or use the link in the description to learn more about the perks like a private Discord channel and having your name appear at the end of every video. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy one of these videos popping up on screen right now. Hope to see you in the next one.
Gary? Gary? Ah, Gary. Gary! Gary! Gary.